It's a map. Look at the second map. It's a map of a curse. It's a map of an arc of terror that Iran has created and imposed from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean.
You've been completely lied to about Iran. There are quite a few countries that our media and politicians want us to perceive as an enemy. A lot of money is invested into the creation and dissemination of propaganda through mass media for this very reason. But, in my opinion, there is no country right now as maligned and lied about more than the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let's be clear, it's not my purpose to extol the virtues of Iran or any other country, but there is an absolutely shocking absence of much needed nuance in discourse on Iran. Even amongst self-professed anti-imperialists, when it comes to Iran, they for some reason decide it's okay to absolve themselves of critical thinking and drink the US State Department Kool-Aid. Let's set the damn record straight. An ancient civilization stretching back thousands of years. Due to its strategic location being a bridge between the Arab world and the rest of Asia, Iran, formerly known also as Persia, has almost always occupied a major role in geopolitics. Its people have made major contributions to the ancient and modern worlds in science, medicine, art, and philosophy. Today, it's a vast and diverse country of over 89 million people made up of various ethnic and religious groups, but most of whom today are Muslim, and particularly Shia Muslim. In the 19th century, Iran was subject to the colonial ambitions of several empires, but particularly the British and Russian empires. During what is called the Great Game, Britain and Russia vied for influence over the Central Asian region and viewed Iran as a strategic buffer state. Although Iran was not formally colonized like its Middle Eastern or Central Asian neighbors, both powers exerted considerable influence and control over Iranian affairs by exploiting its economic weaknesses. Empires gotta eat. See, Iran was still an agrarian society with very little industrial capacity, making it difficult for the country to assert its sovereignty or compete economically. Iran relied heavily on handicrafts, small-scale trade, and subsistence farming, which couldn't generate sufficient revenue to modernize its economy or military. This meant that these two imperial powers could exploit Iranian resources through various treaties and concessions, granting monopolies to foreign entities which undermined local industries. In 1890, Nasr al-Din Shah, then ruler of Iran, granted one such concession to a British company, the Imperial Tobacco Corporation. This concession gave the company exclusive rights over the production, sale, and export of tobacco in Iran for 50 years. The concession infuriated most segments of Iranian society, merchants and farmers, and the general public alike, and the concession threatened local businesses and livelihoods. Scholars and religious leaders, particularly Mirza Hassan Shirazi, played a crucial role in organizing and leading mass protests. Shirazi issued a fatwa, or religious legal ruling, declaring the use of tobacco forbidden as long as the concession remained in place. This fatwa mobilized the population, leading to a nationwide boycott of tobacco. People stopped smoking, cold turkey, and tobacco use dropped dramatically, even within the Shah's own royal court. The protest grew into a larger movement against foreign influence, the concession-based economy, and the Shah's policies. Widespread civil disobedience and economic impact forced Nasr al-Din Shah to cancel the concession in 1892. The successful protest was a major milestone illustrating the influence of Islamic scholars alongside popular people's movements in Iranian society and politics, and set an important precedent for the future of anti-imperialist movements in Iran. Years later, widespread dissatisfaction with the Qajar dynasty's autocratic rule, corruption, and the influence of foreign powers, particularly Britain and Imperial Russia, was rife. Iran's rulers repeatedly borrowed money from Britain and Russia to fund its government, military, and ruling elites' lavish lifestyles. These loans came with high interest rates and unfavorable conditions, trapping Iran in a cycle of debt and further set the stage for more unrest. Sayyid Muhammad Tabatabai, another respected cleric, emerged as a key leader of the constitutional revolution in the early 1900s, advocating for a constitution to limit the Shah's power and ensure justice and representation. Tabatabai's influence and moral authority helped unite diverse groups under the common goal of constitutionalism and democracy, somewhat achieving their goals and forcing the elite's hand into limited reforms. This dynasty would soon be deposed in a British-backed coup, which brought the final Iranian dynasty into power, the Pahlavis. Throughout the early 20th century, Iran's sovereignty was negligible. Fast forward into 1952, Mohammad Mossadegh of the nationalist National Front was elected prime minister by the Iranian parliament with a popular platform among citizens to nationalize the oil industry. Long before this point, many Iranians saw the deepening misery under British control of their main natural resource as just another chapter in their long history of hardship. A few years before, in 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company reported an after-tax profit of £40 million, while giving Iran just £7 million. The company also ignored a 1933 agreement to pay workers more than 50 cents a day, or promises to build schools, hospitals, roads and telephone systems. And reportedly, as late as the 1940s and early 1950s, many British officials believed that Iranian petroleum was genuinely and rightly British because they had discovered, extracted and exploited it with British ingenuity. Britain, angered by Iran's nationalization of its own oil, convinced the United States that Iran was under the risk of being lured by the spectre of communism. Thus, the CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup d'etat approved by the Shah, which deposed the democratically elected Mossadegh and his government, moving to reverse the gains made from the constitutional revolution and handing the pro-Western Shah absolute rule. This was Operation Ajax. According to declassified CIA documents pertaining to the coup, American journalist Stephen Kinzer reported that the regime change operation included false flag attacks, paid protesters, provocations, the bribing of Iranian politicians and high-ranking security and army officials, as well as pro-coup propaganda to consolidate the Shah's increased grip on power. The CIA even reportedly employed Iranian agents posing as communists to harass religious leaders and staged the bombing of one cleric's home in an attempt to turn the country's Islamic religious community against Mossadegh's government. And in the 26 years following the coup, Imperial Iran under the Shah was earmarked as one of the most brutal and regressive regimes in history, with the country being synonymous with martial law and forced disappearances. Shah Pahlavi embarked on an aggressive reforms campaign which seeked to force Iran into a social and economic modernization and westernization. This involved further brutal campaigns of harassment, imprisonment and killings by the Shah's security services, all in order to remold Iran and its cultural and religious identity into a strictly Western and secular one, much like his predecessor had tried previously with policies such as the hijab ban. Iran was an independent and sovereign nation only by name. By the 70s, the country's people were at breaking point. Enter Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric and mystic exiled from Iran in 1964 who became the voice of Iran's revolutionary movement.
When he speaks, millions of Iranians listen. He tells them the Shah should be arrested, tried for crimes against the state, and ousted.
Khomeini's core idea was simple but radical. Islam isn't just about personal faith, it's a tool for liberation. He believed that true Islam stood against oppression, whether it came from a corrupt monarchy or foreign powers. This idea resonated deeply with the Iranian masses who had suffered under the Shah's Western-backed regime. Khomeini's vision for Iran was called Wilayat al-Faqih, or the guardianship of the jurist. In plain terms, it meant that a religious scholar, chosen for their knowledge and moral integrity, would guide the country. Under this model, Iran would have directly elected institutions with a parliament and president, but the supreme leader would ensure the country stayed true to revolutionary ideals. He saw the Shah as a puppet of the West and the Islamic Revolution as a way to break free from foreign oppression. This is why he later famously called the US the Great Satan, Israel the Little Satan, and the Soviet Union the Lesser Satan. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was a declaration that Iran would no longer bow to outside powers and would no longer be subjected to American hegemony. The Shah was overthrown and the Islamic Republic was established after a referendum with an 89% voter turnout, with over 99% of the voters voting yes. He saw the revolution as part of a global struggle against imperialism and inspiring movements across the Muslim world and the global south. A major event that occurred during the revolution was the US embassy hostage crisis, in which a group of armed Iranian university students loyal to Khomeini occupied the US embassy and held the staff there hostage, demanding the US return Mohammad Reza Shah to stand trial in Iran. The embassy is now known to have been a highly important CIA headquarters. And terrified that the Iranians would get their hands on classified documents, the Americans shredded everything in a panic. Some very highly motivated students put back together, piece by piece, classified intel which revealed that the US and Britain were responsible for the coup in 1953. The crisis lasted for over a year and, notably, Khomeini ordered the students to release black Americans and women. He explained, because Islam gives women special rights and black people have lived a long time under pressure and oppression by the Americans. Of course, the Islamic Republic faced and still faces enormous challenges, but at its core, Khomeini's philosophy was about one thing: reclaiming Iran's independence and dignity after centuries of foreign domination, and for many Iranians this was a revolution worth fighting for. The Islamic Republic now faced the daunting task of defending its sovereignty while navigating a hostile international landscape. Iran's severing of all relations with apartheid Israel and apartheid South Africa was a defining early move in solidarity with Palestinians and black South Africans. During the same time, Western governments referred to Mandela and the ANC as terrorists. The United States, furious of the embassy hostage crisis and the loss of its influence in Iran, imposed harsh sanctions and worked to destabilize the republic. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran. The war is often framed as a sectarian conflict, Sunni versus Shia, but this narrative grossly misrepresents the reality. Saddam's aggression wasn't driven by religion, but by opportunism. He saw Iran, still reeling from its revolution, as weak and vulnerable. After frequent clashes along the Iran-Iraq border, Saddam decided to seize Iran's oil-rich and Arab-majority Khuzestan province. The United States, along with its allies in Europe, provided Iraq with intelligence, logistical support, and lots of weapons, including chemical ones. The Soviet Union, despite its rivalry with the West, also supplied Saddam with arms, seeing Iraq as a counterbalance to Iran's revolutionary influence. Meanwhile, Iran stood largely alone. With few allies and under crippling sanctions, it relied on limited support from a handful of non-aligned nations, including China and Syria, and allies within Iraq itself. This lopsided dynamic made the war not just a battle between two nations, but a proxy conflict between Iran and the combined forces of imperialism. It's also important to dispel the myth that this was a sectarian war, as asserted by revisionists. Saddam's brutal treatment of Iraq's Shia population long predated the Iranian Revolution, which Khomeini himself will have witnessed, having lived in exile among them for many years. Saddam banned their religious practices like the annual Arba'in pilgrimage and ruthlessly crushed any dissent. Uprisings by Iraqi Shia against Saddam's rule, such as the 1977 Safa uprising, had already occurred throughout the decade before Iran's revolution, proving their resistance was actually homegrown, not imported from Iran. Anyway, the war itself was catastrophic. Lasting 8 years, it claimed well over 1 million lives and left entire cities in ruins. Saddam's forces used chemical weapons supplied by the West, targeting both Iranian soldiers and civilians in attacks. The Iran-Iraq war exposed the hypocrisy of the international community. While the West condemned chemical weapons in rhetoric, it actively enabled their use against Iran. You may have seen the cringy Iran before Islamic Republic posts which have become a meme. Let's inject a healthy dose of nuance to this debate. According to Iranian journalist Ahmed Farougi in 1974, 4 years before the revolution, for the past 10 years the prevailing climate of terror has stifled all creativity, and Iranian intellectual life has stagnated through lack of stimulation. Literature is well nigh non-existent, and publishing houses rely on carefully pre-selected translations, double-checked by the Savak, to boost their meagre earnings. Poetry has once more resorted to heavily veiled symbolism and allegory. The cinema is entirely dominated by imported American films and a few insipid local productions. This systematic repression has begun to produce disturbing socio-political phenomena that are altering the course of Iran's natural development. The aim of the regime is to westernize Iranian culture, to cut it away from its national roots, flagging Iranian cultural endeavors as counterbalanced by an onslaught of Western, mostly American, cultural propaganda, but only works of a very particular nature. Iranian mass media have become one giant translating machine, its press swamped by American articles chosen from American papers, radio and television feeding off American programs. Iranian cultural values are presented as retrograde and Western anti-values as progressive, upsetting the psychological balance of the nation. Since the revolution, Iran has developed in ways that often defy mainstream narratives. It has fostered a rich cultural renaissance, its cinema, literature and arts gaining global acclaim, standing in stark contrast to the pre-revolution era when Iranian voices were sidelined by Western imports. Socially, the country's trajectory is far more complex than the usual portrayal. Women outnumber men in universities, participate extensively in law, medicine and politics, and enjoy legal protections, some arguably surpassing those in the West, such as robust maternity rights and public healthcare initiatives. Iran also has advanced in medicine and technology despite crushing sanctions, and remains one of the few nations providing state-supported care for transgender individuals, and continues to debate advancements in disability rights and drug reform, to name a few. Yet, Iran's ability to dictate its own progress is constantly undermined. Its domestic policies, often scrutinized and weaponized in Western discourse, cannot be divorced from decades of imperial interference and sanctions designed to cripple the country, but also should not be exclusively analysed through Western cultural norms. Make no mistake, sanctions on Iran are not just economic tools, they're acts of war designed to starve its people and erode their sovereignty. If we're having a conversation about regime changing countries with really bad domestic policies, well, many won't like the answer. Iran, like many other nations, has its own political dynamics, factions with different visions for its future, debates on economic and social policy, but it should be free to progress at its own pace, dictated by its own people, not the colonial ambitions of foreign powers. Hands off the global south. But one thing you cannot take away from Iran is its foreign policy, which in my opinion has proven to be infinitely superior in its ethics than any NATO-aligned nation. The fact of the matter is, Iran is a supporter and vanguard of resistance against American and Zionist designs on the Middle East region, much like revolutionary Cuba was in Latin America and Africa throughout the latter part of the 20th century. All of its foreign intervention must be understood through this lens. They are, alongside Yemen, the biggest and only state supporters of Palestinian liberation in the region. What on earth is more important than opposing genocide? This isn't unique to Iran, of course. Its allies such as Cuba, China, Bolivia or Venezuela face similar campaigns where their achievements are ignored, flaws exaggerated and often fabricated. Iraq too, once Saddam outlived his usefulness, was subject to sensationalism and geopolitically motivated fabrications, such as the Kuwaiti incubators hoax and brutal Western sanctions which directly caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children in the 90s. From so-called diaspora headscarf burning or hair cutting or whatever, liberal hawks who advocate for America bombing the country they claim to care so much about, to weird pseudo-leftist cults who fought alongside Saddam Hussein, and even Persian pro-democracy monarchists. I think the Islamic Republic of Iran wins the prize for having the most deranged American-funded regime change enthusiast diaspora celebrities that you could ever have the displeasure of researching, many of which also happen to, of course, be Zionists. So next time you hear any news about Iran or any other sovereign independent nation of the axis of evil, ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative? What's being left out of the story? Is it possible this is completely made up? What conclusions do they want me to reach? As critical thinkers, it's our responsibility to question these narratives and seek out the full story, especially coming from the imperial core.